The Knife That Killed Me is my newest novel, came out in April this year. Now, the first two novels I wrote for teenagers were basically funny books. They tried to be funny. Hellbent was my first and Henry Tuma was my second. And basically, if you find them funny, then they've worked. If you don't laugh, then they failed. With The Knife That Killed Me, it's a very different sort of a book. The idea actually came from my agent, who phoned me up a couple of years ago and said, why don't you write a book about knives? And I was resistant to this, to say the least, because writers don't like to be told what to do, to begin with. And secondly, it seemed too much of a kind of issues kind of thing, knives. And then it seemed that over the next few months, whenever I opened the local paper or put the news on, there was another teenager stabbing story. And the idea kind of grew in my mind, and the characters started to develop. And out it popped. It's a story about a character, how he's pulled by good and pulled by evil, with a bit of a twist at the end. I mean, one of the differences between when I was a teenager and now is that gangs loom much larger, particularly, I think, in London. I mean, in London, it's gang culture's a product of the unique kind of combination of race and ethnicity, and also, I think, the kind of big gap between the rich and the poor. So what's unique about London is you get immense wealth, cheek by jowl with poverty. So a lot of these estates are very close to rich areas. And so, and because a lot of these estates they're dangerous places, and so young people come together partly for defence, partly for security, partly, I suppose, as a way of making money, you know, that they control drugs. And when you're exposed all the time to wealth around you, and when our culture so values wealth and you haven't got it, well, the obvious thing is you go and get it by illegal means if necessary. There's a big question about whether life has got worse or more violent for teenagers today, and obviously knives play a role in that. But I went to a very tough comprehensive in Leeds back in the 70s and 80s, and it really was in some ways quite a grim place. There was a lot of violence between the students, from the teachers to the students. You know, it was a scary place in many ways. But I actually had a great time for, again, complex reasons. But I never in all my time at this inner city, tough Leeds comprehensive saw or even heard about any of the kids carrying knives. I mean, there was one guy who reckoned he had a flick knife, which he'd bought in France, which is one of the kind of popular myths about that time. But I don't think he had a flick knife, and I don't think he'd been to France. So I think that in some way, in many ways, schools now, because I do a lot of school visits, in some ways they're more gentle places. I think there's actually less overall violence. But the difference is that now the violence is always potentially fatal. Because there is this, you know, whatever it is, 10, 15, 20% of school kids who carry knives. And so any altercation potentially is now deadly, in a way that in my youth it just wasn't. You got a beating, you got a black eye, a bloody nose, you got stamped on, but you didn't die. One of the key facts about knives is that anyone can get hold of a knife. You open your kitchen drawer, you go to your knife block, and you've got a deadly weapon in your hands. So, you know, in a way that, although people are worried about guns proliferating, it's still quite hard to get hold of a gun. You know, I did some research on how you get hold of a gun for my adult thrillers, and it's difficult. You know, you need to know the right person, and if you don't know that person, you just won't get hold of a gun, and they're expensive. Whereas you can buy a knife for £2.50, and then you've got a lethal weapon in your hand. And I think that there's something about boys and knives in particular. I mean, I felt it myself. You know, I've got a nice Swiss Army knife. There's something about the kind of gadgety aspect of having a knife, which I think also appeals to boys. This thing that this heavy, weighty thing that gives you a sense of power and empowerment. But also something's changed from my day. That there was some kind of barrier that stopped you carrying a knife when I was a youth, and now that isn't there anymore. There isn't that huge psychological barrier, and there's enormously complicated sociological reasons for that. And the factors are probably too complex to analyse now. But I think one of the key things is it's become almost like a fashion thing. It's just, you know, you put on your trainers and you take your knife. You know, it's no longer, it's hardly an issue at all. It's just something you carry with you, or like a mobile phone. And that's, again, why it's so potentially deadly, that all young boys get into altercations with each other. But now, rather than an exchange of kicks and punches, you get an exchange of stabs. It's become a kind of media frenzy thing, the whole thing about knives. The tabloids do love a stabbing. It's a great way of getting a good front page. And so it's really hard to know exactly what's happening with the real crime figures. Are they going up or down? But I think underlying those kind of difficulties over the statistics, I think there really is an actual phenomena of young people stabbing each other, which just wasn't there in the past. Or I suppose it's there's been particular times and particular place in the past where knives were part of culture. An obvious example is Glasgow in the 50s, where you had, gangs of youths kniving each other. But there were particular reasons for that rising and falling in Glasgow, and there's a new phenomenon now in London in particular. Well, I suspect that teenagers today, in many ways, are quite similar to the way that I was when I was a teenager. The things that are on your mind are girls, football, getting through each day, doing your homework. So I'm not sure there's that much different in many ways, but it's apart from this kind of group at the bottom somehow where and then they tend to be the most impoverished in all kinds of ways. The ones that don't have access to the computers, the ones that don't read books, are the ones who turn to gangs in particular and knife crime. I do think that teenagers now, often they're incredibly sweet. I do a lot of school visits and I'm often entirely charmed by them. And they seem in many ways more articulate than I was when I was that age, more open to different cultures and different things. So, I actually love teenagers now. But still, occasionally I'll come across a group where there's that kind of sullen resentment. And it's very hard to break through that sometimes. It's actually my idea to stay at home and be the primary carer. Because I had this naive idea that what I could do is I'd be looking after a child for half an hour, then perhaps writing some book for half an hour, then a bit more looking after the child, a bit more writing book. What I didn't realise was both the intense boredom of it and the hard work and the misery and the pushing the pushchair through the pouring rain for hour after hour, desperately trying to get your child to sleep. I think if I'd known then what I know now about the reality of being the primary carer, I might have taken a slightly different path. Even though it's in many ways immensely satisfying and rewarding, and I love my kids, I think they love me, it was hard. My dad, he's still alive, he's 80, went to his 80th birthday quite recently. He was, I think, quite unusual for his time, that he always did all the cooking in our household. So he was kind of a newish kind of dad before the letter. He was a nurse that became an NHS manager, so he was a very kind of kind and caring man, but also with quite a lot of bluster to him. And he was an amazing storyteller. I'm sure that's part of why I'm a writer. But he never actually used to read us books. He'd simply kind of come in and tell us bedtime stories. And we'd all kind of lie in bed listening to him, and he'd lie on his back and just make up the stories. So that's my abiding memory of my dad, is him as a storyteller, I suppose. My number one parenting tip is the Chinese burn when they're being really naughty. Because what you can do is you can say, okay, give me a Chinese burn, and then I'll give you one. And obviously they don't give particularly effective Chinese burns, but you can if you want to. And it leaves no mark.